food!
All right, hold your horses. I had a lot to carry in for you two, but luckily this merry mail carrier was nice enough to give me a hand with your food order. Thank you, Postal Employee Newman.
Ta-ta.
Hey guys, check it out. Vic Anne, this attractive woman who said she was the heiress to the O. Henry candy bar fortune, was giving these away. Now, luckily, this shouldn't take too long because I just spent the last hour creating a candy lineup to make sure I got you everything you wanted.
It took you an hour?
Look, I don't have time to coach and argue with you rubes all at the same time. I thought you might like some chocolate syrup, so I got you some Bosco. Now, I was able to find a Twix bar, but it was the last one in the vending machine. So I got you a Hershey bar. You know, I can remember when you used to be able to get a Hershey for a nickel. I got you your Skittles. You know, it's one of the only candies that doesn't have swirling chocolate in the commercials. Here are your Juji Fruits.
Oh, I love them.
Don't talk with your mouth full. Here's your Junior Mints. You know, they're very refreshing. Oh, and here's your Pez dispenser. Man, these things are hard to load.
Tell me something I don't know.
Now, I wanted to get you something to drink. Snapple?
No. Too fruity.
Well, how about Yoo-Hoo?
I love Yoo-Hoo.
It's a fine product.
Didn't you get yourself anything?
Did I ever? Drake's Coffee Cakes. I got a whole box of them.
Is that the full size?
That's your big boy. I got another one, but I'm saving it for later. Now, wait a minute. Where's the rest of my candy? Where are all these wrappers? Oh, I know the chunky that left these chunkies. Newman! I'll deal with him later. Just give me a moment to put these away. I'll be right back. All right, now we can get started. You're probably both wondering, why do I do just as you say? And why must I just give you your way when I don't really know either of you very well? Why do I sigh? I guess it's because I've never coached identical twins before. But I'll tell you what, why don't I try to forget that for a moment? After all, I'm sure it must have been something that other coaches have had to contend with. So let's figure out all of the confusion that the two of you have been describing. Antipholus, I mean this one. You're saying that you only got to Ephesus this morning, but that you wandered around, and I believe you said that you finally found your manservant Dromio, but he didn't seem to know what you were talking about. Based on what you've told me, I think the person you saw was somebody who looked like your servant, but was actually somebody else. Didn't you say that he had an identical twin brother too? This could make me believe that what I suspect could be true. And I should think that both of you would be relieved and even be glad to know that you've crossed paths with each other's men without even realizing it. It sounds like some others mixed up the two of you as well. In fact, your wife might never be mean, might never be cross or try to be boss if she knew who he really was. You might still be upset with Adriana and her sister Luciana, but they wouldn't do anything to upset you had they known the truth. Well, gentlemen, there's no charge for today's session, for nobody else gave me a thrill like you two. Oh, by the way, before you go, which one of you borrowed the $20 from me? It had to be you. Wonderful. You! It had to be you. Thank you. Let me just grab my wallet.
What was that?
I think I had some hard candy in there. In the early 1960s, The Patty Duke Show debuted on television with the unlikely premise of having a pair of identical cousins. Obviously, two teenage girls with completely different personalities could result in a lot of confusion and a lot of humor. But Shakespeare, who was the father of twins himself, knew about this over 400 years ago and decided to do a play about identical twins called The Comedy of Errors. And if you think having one pair of identical twins would be fun, try multiplying them by 2. So let's take a look at the plot. The play opens in Ephesus. Since the law forbids merchants of Syracuse from entering Ephesus, an elderly Syracusan trader named Aegeon is facing execution when he's discovered in the city. The only way he can escape is by paying a fine of 1,000 marks. Aegeon tells his sad story to Solinus, the Duke of Ephesus, how in his youth he married a woman named Amelia, and the couple had twin boys. On the very same day, a poor woman who had no job also gave birth to twin sons, and Aegeon and his wife purchased these boys to be their sons' servants. Not long after, the family made a sea voyage and got caught in a tempest. Aegeon lashed himself to the mainmast along with one son and one servant, while his wife Amelia took the other 2 infants. His wife was rescued by one boat, Aegeon was rescued by another, and he never saw his wife or his children with her again. However, when Aegeon's son Antipholus was of age, he left Syracuse along with his son's servant Dromio to find their brothers. But when Antipholus failed to return, Aegeon set out in search of him. The Duke is so moved by this story that he grants Aegeon one day in order to come up with enough money to pay his fine. On the very same day, Antipholus arrives in Ephesus searching for his brother. He sends Dromio to deposit some money at an inn called the Centaur. He is confused when the identical Dromio of Ephesus appears, almost immediately, denies any knowledge of the money, and instead asks Antipholus to come home to dinner where his wife is waiting for him. Antipholus thinks Dromio is kidding around and beats him soundly. Dromio of Ephesus then returns to his mistress Adriana and tells her that her husband refused to come back to his house and even pretended not to know her. Adriana already thinks that her husband might be cheating on her, and she sees Dromio's account as a confirmation of her suspicions. Meanwhile, Antipholus of Syracuse meets up with Dromio of Syracuse, who now denies making any joke about Antipholus having a wife. Antipholus begins beating him. Suddenly, Adriana rushes up to Antipholus of Syracuse and begs him not to leave her. The Syracusans are confused and believe these strange events are the result of witchcraft, even stating that Ephesus is known to be a place of sorcery and witches. However, Antipholus and Dromio eventually follow Adriana to her home, where Antipholus has dinner with her, while Dromio guards the door. Once he's inside the house, Antipholus of Syracuse gets a lecture from his wife's sister, Luciana, that he should be more devoted to Adriana, even if he only married her for her money. At that point, he realizes that he could very easily fall in love with Luciana, and he tells her so. While she's flattered by his attention, she's also shocked and outraged by the moral implications. After she exits, Dromio of Syracuse announces that he's discovered that he's betrothed to Nell, a greasy kitchen wench, describing her appearance as spherical, like a globe. The two men decide to leave as soon as possible, and Dromio goes off to make travel arrangements. While this is happening, Antipholus of Syracuse meets Angelo, a goldsmith, who says that Antipholus ordered a gold chain from him. Antipholus takes the chain, and Angelo says that he'll return later to collect the payment. Meanwhile, Antipholus of Ephesus returns home for dinner and flies into a fit of rage when he's obnoxiously refused entry into his own house by Dromio of Syracuse, who's inside keeping the gate. Antipholus is about to break down the door when his friends persuade him not to make a scene. They prevail over him, and he decides to dine with a courtesan instead. At the same time, Antipholus of Ephesus sends Dromio of Ephesus to buy a rope so that he can beat his wife Adriana for locking him out of his own home. But Antipholus is interrupted by Angelo, the goldsmith, who comes back to get reimbursed for the gold chain. Antipholus says that he never saw the chain, and Angelo has him arrested. But just as he's being carted off, Dromio of Syracuse arrives, and Antipholus sends him back to Adriana's house to get the money for his bail. But after he completes his errand, Dromio of Syracuse mistakenly delivers the money to Antipholus of Syracuse. When the courtesan sees Antipholus wearing the gold chain that he promised to exchange for her ring, she confronts him about it. The men, believing she's a sorcerer, run away. The courtesan is angry about being cheated and decides that she's going to tell Adriana that her husband is insane. Meanwhile, Dromio of Ephesus brings the rope that he purchased to the incarcerated Antipholus of Ephesus. Antipholus is furious because he's been waiting for his bail money. But just then, Adriana, Luciana, and the courtesan enter with a conjurer named Dr. Pinch. Pinch tries to exorcise Antipholus and Dromio, who are then bound and taken to Adriana's house. Minutes later, the Syracusans enter with their swords drawn, and everybody runs off in fear, thinking that the Ephesians are seeking revenge after somehow breaking free of their bonds. Adriana employs the assistance of some henchmen who attempt to bind the Syracusans, but they take sanctuary in a nearby priory, where the abbess refuses to have any others enter her house. Adriana begs the Duke for justice and tries to explain all of the confusion that's been going on. The Duke is just as confused as the others and begins to think that they're all mad. But suddenly, the abbess brings the Syracusan twins out of her home, and all the confusion is cleared up. Not only are the two sets of twins reunited, but the abbess reveals that she is Aegeon's long-lost wife Amelia. The Duke then grants Aegeon a full pardon, and everyone enters the abbey to celebrate the family's happy reunion. When we return, we'll look at some of the remarkable characters in the Comedy of Errors. The Comedy of Errors is considered to be one of Shakespeare's earliest comedies. For that reason, he probably went with the very simple premise of using the mistaken identities of identical twins to create most of the humor in the play. While it certainly worked, having funny characters also helped, so let's take a look at the prominent ones. Aegeon is the father of twin sons who, for some reason, are both named Antipholus. He and his wife Amelia are both separated at sea, and neither one of them knows where the other is. He sadly comes to Ephesus and discovers that, as a Syracusan, the law condemns him to death for entering the city. Remarkably, on the same day that the Antipholi are born, another woman gives birth to the Dromios, another set of identical twin boys. Since the mother is poor, Aegeon and Amelia buy their children to be playfellows and servants to their own sons. One Antipholus and one Dromio grow up in Ephesus, the other pair grow up in Syracuse, and when they come of age, go in search of their missing siblings. Antipholus of Ephesus is married to Adriana, who suspects that her husband might be straying towards other women. Adriana's beautiful, unmarried sister Luciana tries to comfort, counsel, and reassure her sister that that's not the case. Unfortunately, when Antipholus of Syracuse is mistakenly brought to Adriana's home, he realizes that he's in love with Luciana. And when the Syracusan Dromio comes to Adriana's house, he discovers that he is betrothed to a greasy kitchen wench who goes by the name of Nell, and for some reason, Luce and Dowsabel. The Duke of Ephesus serves as both the enforcer of the law condemning Aegeon to death and as the arbiter to clarify all the confusion Adriana and Antipholus unfold to him at the end of the play. And finally, there's also a character only known as the courtesan, who indicates that Antipholus of Ephesus is a good customer of hers, but we're never really sure if that means he's being unfaithful to his wife or he just likes to socialize with a prostitute. When we return, we'll look at some of the plot devices and memorable scenes in the Comedy of Errors. In this play, we'll see some of the same plot devices that Shakespeare used in some of his other plays. First of all, we have another shipwreck that results in characters being separated from one another. We've seen Shakespeare do this in Twelfth Night, Pericles, Prince of Tyre, and The Tempest. In addition, two sets of characters are identical twins, which leads to much of the confusion. As we know, this is what Shakespeare did in Twelfth Night when he separated the male and female twins Sebastian and Viola respectively. We also have another inflexible law that seems to be very unjust. In this case, any Syracusan setting foot in Ephesus is to be executed. Shakespeare used similar harsh punishments for committing adultery in Measure for Measure and for disobeying your father's choice of husband in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Shakespeare often used rings as plot devices to demonstrate a symbol of fidelity and commitment. In this play, Antipholus has Angelo the goldsmith make a chain for his wife, but when he gets mad at Adriana, he tells the courtesan that he will exchange the chain for her ring. And finally, Shakespeare also loves to have one character suing for or wooing another character for somebody else, and then having the wooee, if you will, fall in love with the person who's wooing them instead. It happens in Twelfth Night, As You Like It, and for a while Claudio thinks that Don Pedro woos Hero for himself in Much Ado About Nothing, but that turned out to be just a villainous deceit perpetrated by Don John. As far as memorable scenes go, let's just look at two. First, in Act 3, Scene 2, Dromio of Syracuse discovers that he's betrothed to marry Nell, the greasy kitchen wench who works for Adriana and Antipholus. His description of Nell is hysterical and one of the high points of the play. Dromio describes her to Antipholus of Syracuse no longer from head to foot than from hip to hip. She is spherical, like a globe. I could find out countries in her. Antipholus asks, "In what part of her body stands Ireland?" Dromio answers, "Marry, sir, in her buttocks. I found it out by the bugs." Then Antipholus asks, "Where Scotland?" Dromio replies, "I found it by the Baroness hard in the palm of the hand." Next Antipholus asks, "Where France?" Dromio answers, "In her forehead, armed and reverted, making war against her heir." Then Antipholus asks, "Where England?" Dromio replies, "I looked for the chalky cliffs, but I could find no whiteness in them, but I guess it stood in her chin by the salt room that ran between France and it." Antipholus next asks, "Where Spain?" Dromio answers, "Faith, I saw it not, but I felt it hot in her breath." Antipholus asks, "Where America, the Indies?" Dromio replies, "Oh, sir, upon her nose, all over embellished with rubies, carbuncles, sapphires, declining their rich aspect to the hot breath of Spain, who sent whole armadas of carracks to be ballast at her nose." Finally, Antipholus asks him, "Where stood Belgia, the Netherlands?" And Dromio answers, "Oh, sir, I did not look so low." And finally, in Act 5, Scene 1, we have another magnificent wrap-up scene where all of the plots and confusion are not only explained away, but family members are happily reunited with one another. This worked exceptionally well in Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, Pericles, Prince of Tyre, Measure for Measure, and to a lesser degree in As You Like It, The Merry Wives of Windsor, and The Merchant of Venice. When we return, we'll look at some of the major themes that run through the Comedy of Errors. The genre of farce requires the audience to suspend their disbelief and accept certain far-fetched or improbable premises. When I was in high school, my friends and I had a signal that we would give each other whenever we felt somebody was telling us a story that we felt was unbelievable. For example, in the Comedy of Errors, we're asked to accept that not only do two different mothers give birth to identical twin sons in the same hour and in the same inn, but that each of the parents would name both children the exact same name. In addition, we must buy the fact that one set of parents would sell their sons to the other set of parents, that the entire group would be caught in a shipwreck and be separated along with one parent and one twin of each pair, and that decades later, they would all wind up in the exact same city at the same time, and when they finally meet, each of the twins would coincidentally be dressed like their counterparts. There's also usually a lot of slapstick physical comedy involved in farce. As we see in the Comedy of Errors, because of the confusion caused by mixing up the Antipholi and the Dromios, the twin slaves are constantly being beaten by their masters throughout the play, which adds a lot to the physical humor. Shakespeare was also fond of having separated family members because he knew that having the audience long for them to be reunited at the end would bring about the desired happy ending. And isn't that what we all want to see? Let's face it, you can't have a comedy that includes two sets of identical twins without having a lot of confusion. The fact that both sets of twins are dressed exactly the same adds to even more confusion. Shakespeare was wise to confine all of his characters in this play to a very limited central location, allowing characters to continuously be mistaken for one another. The word mad is used about 30 times in this play, more than in Hamlet or in King Lear. Many of the characters in this play are thought to be mad, even though in reality none of them are. In addition, some of them even start to doubt their own sanity because of all the confusion, especially Dromio and Antipholus of Syracuse. In Act 2, Scene 2, Antipholus asks himself, "Am I in earth, in heaven, or in hell? Sleeping or waking, mad or well advised? Known unto these and to myself disguised. I'll say as they say, and persever so, and in this mist at all adventures go." When we return, we'll look at some of the most powerful lines in the Comedy of Errors. It wasn't until I started preparing this episode that I realized just how many great lines there are in the Comedy of Errors. Let's take a look at some of the more interesting and moving passages. First, we have the upset Adriana, who's convinced that her husband Antipholus is late coming home because he's been unfaithful to her. And I love Luciana's unsolicited advice to her married sister Adriana in Act 1, Scene 2. She says, "Why, headstrong liberty is lashed with woe. There's nothing situate under heaven's eye, but hath his bound in earth, in sea, in sky. The beasts, the fishes, and the winged fowls are their male subjects and at their controls. Man, more divine, the master of all these, Lord of the wide world and wild watery seas, endued with intellectual sense and souls of more preeminence than fish and fowls, are masters to their females and their lords. Then let your will attend on their accords." Adriana says, "This servitude makes you to keep unwed." Luciana replies, "Not this, but troubles of the marriage bed." Adriana says, "But were you wedded, you would bear some sway." Luciana replies, "Ere I learn love, I'll practice to obey." Adriana says, "Patience unmoved. No marvel though she pause, they can be meek that have no other cause." But Adriana has her own opinions on marriage in which she expresses her dissatisfaction with her husband's apparent neglect of her. This is also in Act 1, Scene 2. She complains of her husband, "His company must do his minions grace, whilst I at home starve for a merry look. Hath homely age the alluring beauty took from my poor cheek? Then he hath wasted it. Are my discourses dull? Barren my wit? If voluble and sharp discourse be married, unkindness blunts it more than marble hard. Do their gay vestments his affections bait? That's not my fault. He's master of my state. What ruins are in me that can't be found by him not ruined? Then is he the ground of my defeatures. But too unruly dear, he breaks the pail and feeds from home. Poor, I am but his stale." She continues to rail, Unfeeling fools can with such wrongs dispense. I know his eye doth homage elsewhere, or else what lets it but he would be here? Sister, you know he promised me a chain. With that alone a love he would detain, so he would keep fair quarter with his bed. I see the jewel best enamelled will lose his beauty. Yet the gold bides still, that others touch, and often touching will wear gold, yet no man that hath a name by falsehood or corruption doth it shame. Since that my beauty cannot please his eye, I'll weep what's left away, and weeping die. How many fond fools serve mad jealousy, Luciana says. In Act 2, Scene 2, Adriana starts off accusing her husband of straying. I, Antipholus, look strange and frown. Some other mistress hath thy sweet aspects. How dearly would it touch thee to the quick, shouldst thou but hear I were licentious, and that this body, consecrate to thee, by ruffian lust should be contaminate? Wouldst thou not spit at me and spurn at me, and hurl the name of husband in my face, and tear the stained skin off my harlot brow, and from my false hand cut the wedding ring and break it with a deep divorcing vow? I know thou canst, and therefore see thou do it. I am possessed with an adulterate blot. My blood is mingled with the crime of lust. For if we two be one, and thou play false, I do digest the poison of thy flesh, being strumpeted by thy contagion. In other words, she's saying that since husband and wife are of one flesh, if her husband cheats, that means that she's also disloyal. And then she finishes up by saying, keep then fair league and truce with thy true bed. I live disdained, thou undishonored. There's also a great confrontation scene when Adriana and Luciana go out and bring the wrong Antipholus back home. In Act 3, Scene 2, Luciana sues for Adriana to Antipholus, saying, and may it be that you have quite forgot a husband's office? Shall Antipholus, even in the spring of love, thy love springs rot? Shall love in building grow so ruinous? If you did wed my sister for her wealth, then for her wealth's sake use her with more kindness. Or, if you like elsewhere, do it by stealth. Muffle your false love with some show of blindness. Let not my sister read it in your eye. Be not thy tongue thy own shame's orator. Look sweet, speak fair, become disloyalty, apparel vice, like virtue's harbinger. Bear a fair presence, though your heart be tainted. Teach sin the carriage of a holy saint. Be secret false. What need she be acquainted? What simple thief brags of his own attaint? 'Tis double wrong to truant with your bed, and let her read it in thy looks at board. Shame hath a bastard fame, well managed, ill deeds is doubled with an evil word. Alas, poor women, make us but believe, being compact of credit, that you love us. Though others have the arm, show us the sleeve. We in your motion turn, and you may move us. Then, gentle brother, get you in again. Comfort my sister, cheer her, call her wife. 'Tis holy sport to be a little vain, when the sweet breath of flattery conquers strife. And finally, there's a couple of short, memorable proverbs in this play. In Act 3, Scene 1, the long-winded Balthazar wisely counsels Antipholus, saying, for slander lives upon succession, forever housed where it gets possession. What he means is that once slander takes root, it's almost impossible for people to forget about it. And in Act 5, Scene 1, the abbess counsels Adriana by saying, the venom clamors of a jealous woman poisons more deadly than a mad dog's tooth, meaning that a wife's words can inflict more pain than a dog bite. It also reminds me of King Lear railing about how sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. When we return, we'll look at some of the major turning points in the Comedy of Errors and correlations to some of the other Shakespeare plays. All right, now let's take a look at 3 key turning points in the Comedy of Errors. First, we have Act 3, Scene 2, when Luciana mistakenly pleads with Antipholus of Syracuse to be a good husband to her sister Adriana, and he falls in love with her instead. Once this happens, Adriana tells her sister, and she's convinced that he is an unfaithful husband. Next, we have Act 4, Scene 1, where Angelo the goldsmith has Antipholus of Ephesus arrested and forces him to send Dromio home to his wife to get money for his bail, thus bringing all of the characters together to clear up the confusion. And finally, in Act 5, Scene 1, both Antipholus and Dromio of Syracuse enter the abbess's priory for sanctuary, which forces the abbess to come outside, uncover the confusion, and get reunited with her husband and her sons. There are also very many interesting correlations between the Comedy of Errors and some of the other Shakespeare plays. For example, the twin Antipholi and Dromios are separated from one another by shipwreck, but eventually they all come ashore in the same town. In Twelfth Night, twins Viola and Sebastian are separated after a shipwreck, but eventually come ashore in the same town and are also mistaken for one another. Aegeon discovers that there's a law sentencing death to any Syracusan who enters Ephesus. In The Taming of the Shrew, the pedant is told by Tranio that it is death to anyone from Mantua who enters Padua, even though this really isn't true. In The Midsummer Night's Dream, Helena discovers that she could be sentenced to death by Athenian law for refusing to marry her father's choice of husband. In Measure for Measure, Claudio discovers that he's sentenced to death by Viennese law for committing adultery, and in The Merchant of Venice, Antonio discovers that the Venetian law is powerless to prevent him from being sentenced to pay a pound of his own flesh, and in essence dying in the process for forfeiting his bond to Shylock. Antipholus of Syracuse disguises himself to avoid punishment for being in Ephesus. In The Two Noble Kinsmen, Arcite risks death by staying in Athens because he's in love with Emilia. In Romeo and Juliet, Romeo risks death by returning to Verona because he's in love with Juliet and wants to die with her. In Twelfth Night, Antonio risks death by going into Illyria because of his brotherly love for Sebastian, and in Richard II, Henry Bolingbroke risks death by returning to England after being banished in order to reclaim his father's lands. When Emilia is separated from her husband Aegeon after a shipwreck, she enters a priory in Ephesus. When Thaisa is separated from her husband Pericles in Pericles, Prince of Tyre, after a shipwreck, she enters the temple of Diana in Pentapolis. Conversely, Isabella leaves the convent in Vienna at the beginning of Measure for Measure when she learns that her brother's life is at stake. The unmarried Luciana lectures her married sister Adriana about wifely duties and behavior. In The Taming of the Shrew, newlywed Kate also lectures her newlywed sister Bianca and others about wifely duties and behavior. Antipholus is described as melancholy, joining Jaques in As You Like It, Henry IV in Henry IV Part 2, Brutus in Julius Caesar, Don John in Much Ado About Nothing, both Orsino and Olivia in Twelfth Night, Marianne in Measure for Measure, and Hamlet in Hamlet. Luciana sues for her sister Adriana to Antipholus of Syracuse, who falls in love with her instead. In Twelfth Night, Viola, disguised as Cesario, woos for Orsino to Olivia, who falls in love with her instead. And in As You Like It, Rosalind, disguised as Ganymede, sues for Silvius to Phoebe, who falls in love with her instead. Both of the Antipholi beat their servants, the Dromios. In The Taming of the Shrew, Petruchio beats his servants, especially Grumio. Antipholus accuses the courtesan of being a witch. Master Ford accuses the old woman of Brainford for being a witch in The Merry Wives of Windsor. Eleanor, the Duchess of Gloucester, cavorts with witches in Henry VI, Part 2, and Lady Macbeth conjures spirits while her husband employs witches for prophecies in Macbeth. Antipholus associates with the courtesan. Lucio associates with Mistress Overdone and Kate Keepdown in Measure for Measure. Lysimachus associates with a bawd in Pericles, Prince of Tyre. Falstaff associates with Doll Tearsheet in Henry IV, Part 2. Michael Cassio has a relationship with a local courtesan named Bianca in Othello, and Alcibiades travels with a couple of prostitutes named Phrynia and Timandra in Timon of Athens. Angelo the goldsmith is arrested for failure to pay a debt he owes to another merchant. In The Merchant of Venice, Antonio is arrested for failure to pay a debt he owes to Shylock, a moneylender. Antipholus is thought to be mad and is held in a dark and dankish vault. In Twelfth Night, Malvolio is thought to be mad and is held in a dark chamber. In Troilus and Cressida, Cassandra is thought to be mad and must be restrained. In Macbeth, Lady Macbeth actually does go mad after having King Duncan killed. King Lear goes mad after being treated shamefully by his daughters Regan and Goneril. And in Henry VI, Part 2, Cardinal Winchester goes mad after having the Duke of Gloucester murdered and dies a horrible death himself. Adriana pleads for justice to the Duke at the end of the Comedy of Errors. Isabella pleads for justice to the Duke at the end of Measure for Measure. At the end of the Comedy of Errors, Duke Solinus pardons Aegeon despite Ephesian law. At the end of The Merchant of Venice, the Duke of Venice pardons Antonio despite Venetian law. At the end of A Midsummer Night's Dream, Duke Theseus pardons Hermia despite Athenian law, and at the end of Measure for Measure, Duke Vincentio pardons Claudio despite Viennese law. Then why do they have all these laws in the first place? And finally, Amelia is reunited with Aegeon, her long-lost husband, less than 100 lines before the end of the play. Imogen is reunited with Posthumus, her long-lost husband, at the end of Cymbeline. Thaisa is reunited with Pericles, her long-lost husband, at the end of Pericles, Prince of Tyre. Hermione is reunited with Leontes, her long-lost husband, at the end of The Winter's Tale. Hal is reunited with his father at the end of Henry IV, Part 2. And Cordelia is reunited with her long-lost father at the end of King Lear. When we return, we'll look at some interesting facts about the Comedy of Errors. In preparing to do this episode, I did some research, and this is what I found. The Comedy of Errors was written between 1592 and its first performance on December 28, 1594, at Gray's Inn in London as part of some Christmas festivities. Shakespeare took the story from the Roman play by Plautus called the Menaechmi and changed the location from Epidamnum, which was located in modern-day Albania, to Ephesus, which is located in modern-day Turkey. By the way, Corinth is located in modern-day Greece, and Syracuse is located on Sicily, which is part of Italy. Shakespeare moved the play to Ephesus because it was known as a place for madness, sorcery, and dark magic, which are all elements that come through in this play. In addition, he also included several themes from St. Paul's letters to the Ephesians, as well as to the Hebrews and the Romans. For example, in St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 5, verses 2 and 3, he wrote, "Let women be subject to their husbands as to the Lord, because the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church." Also in verse 31 he wrote, "For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall be two in one flesh." This is what Adriana is alluding to when she tells her husband that if he's unfaithful to her, it means that she's also being a strumpet. In addition, in his epistle to the Romans, chapter 12, verse 10, he wrote, "Loving one another with charity of brotherhood, with honor preventing one another." And in St. Paul's letter to the Hebrews, chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, he wrote, "Let the charity of the brotherhood abide in you, And hospitality do not forget, for by this some, being not aware of it, have entertained angels. By the way, Ephesus is also believed to be where the deaths of John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene took place, and also possibly the Virgin Mary. In the Menichmi, Plautus used about 17 instances of mistaken identity encounters, whereas Shakespeare used about 50. The Comedy of Errors is Shakespeare's shortest play, with only about 1,777 lines, not many more than Hamlet alone speaks in all of Hamlet. Shakespeare followed Aristotle's principles for Greek tragedies, specifically the three unities of time, place, and action, in that the entire play takes place in one location, in one day, and all the action is related. The only other play in which Shakespeare does this is The Tempest. By the way, The Comedy of Errors and King Lear are the only two Shakespeare plays in which he ever mentions football. There is some confusion over just how much time has passed from when the twins were lost at sea until they were reunited. Even though Amelia says that she's been searching for 33 years, other mentions by Aegeon and Antipholus indicate that it may have only been as few as 22 or 23 years. Also, for some unexplained reason, Dromio of Ephesus's fiancée seems to have three different names, as she's referred to as Luce, Nell, and Dowsabel. And Antipholus says that he sent Dromio to get 500 ducats to pay for the chain, but the courtesan who said that he was going to exchange the chain for her ring said she would only be out 40 ducats if he cheated her. Shakespeare himself was the father of twins, a daughter named Judith and a son named Hamnet. In 1938, Rodgers and Hart created a musical version of the Comedy of Errors entitled The Boys from Syracuse. And finally, the expression a comedy of errors has now become a catchphrase meaning a series of mishaps and confusion that compound and snowball out of control. When we return, we'll look at some of the great actors in the 1983 BBC Shakespeare version of the Comedy of Errors. All right, now let's take a look at some of the actors in the 1983 BBC Shakespeare version of the Comedy of Errors. Michael Kitchen, who plays both Antipholus of Syracuse and Antipholus of Ephesus, also played Edmund in King Lear in 1982. Bunny Reed, who played the jailer, also played Abraham in Romeo and Juliet in 1978. Noel Johnson, who plays the first merchant, also played Publius in Julius Caesar in 1979. Joanne Pierce, who plays Luciana, also played Sylvia in The Two Gentlemen of Verona in 1983. Sam Dasher, who plays Angelo the goldsmith, also played Casca in Julius Caesar in 1979. Frank Williams, who plays an officer, also played Constable Anthony Dull in Love's Labour's Lost in 1985. Wendy Hiller, who plays Amelia, also played the Duchess of York in Richard II in 1978. Ross Davidson and Nicholas Chagrin, who make up part of the Mime Troupe, played a pirate and a policeman, respectively, in the 1983 Gilbert and Sullivan movie musical The Pirates of Penzance, opposite Linda Ronstadt and Kevin Kline. The talented Suzanne Bertish, who plays Adriana, also played Fanny Squeers, Miss Snevellicci, and various other characters in the 1982 Royal Shakespeare Company production of The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. Charles Gray, who plays Silenus, Duke of Ephesus, also played Julius Caesar in 1978, Pandarus in Troilus and Cressida in 1981, and the Duke of York in Richard II in 1983. You might also recognize him as the criminologist in the 1975 cult classic The Rocky Horror Picture Show. And finally, Roger Daltrey, the lead singer of The Who, played both Dromio of Syracuse and Dromio of Ephesus. I must admit, my favorite part of this production is watching a multi-million-dollar rock star get continuously snacked around. But I must admit, he was a good sport about it. When we return, we'll be ready for today's trivia challenge, which is called Same Name, Different Character. All right, now it's time for today's trivia challenge, which is called Same Name, Different Character. Sometimes Shakespeare used the same name for more than one character in different plays. Identify the Shakespeare play in which these lesser-known characters appear. Number 1, Montague, the Earl of Salisbury's nephew. Number 2, Troilus, Petruchio's spaniel. And number 3, Bolingbroke, a conjurer for Dame Eleanor. When we return, I'll have the answers for you, and we'll wrap up with some relevant lessons from the Comedy of Errors. Okay, now let's see how you did on today's trivia challenge called Same Name, Different Character. As I mentioned, sometimes Shakespeare used the same name for more than one character in different plays. You are to identify the Shakespeare plays in which these lesser-known characters appear. Number 1, Montague, the Earl of Salisbury's nephew. That would be from Edward III. Number 2, Troilus, Petruchio's spaniel. That would be The Taming of the Shrew. And number 3, Bolingbroke, a conjurer for Dame Eleanor. That is from Henry VI, Part 2. Now, let's wrap up with some relevant lessons from the Comedy of Errors. First, no matter how thin you slice it, there are always two sides. When you're facing a conflict with somebody else, endeavor to see it from the other person's point of view. Second, marriage is a two-way street. The only way to have the perfect spouse is to strive on being the perfect spouse. And finally, master your communication and you'll master your life. When it comes to your messaging, don't make it longer, make it clearer. As a friend of mine once told me, remember that the only thing that separates us is the English language. I'm Dave Romeo, and thank you for watching this episode of Romeo and Shakespeare. Please join me next time when a bunchback toad finally has his day and executes anyone who tries to get in his way.